The Dark History of Medieval Midwives, Walpurga's Quiet Undoing. Approximate 1500 to 2000 words. Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back into a world where villages were small, candles were expensive, and everybody apparently had the time and energy to accuse their neighbors of sorcery. So, go ahead and dim the lights, settle in, maybe take a slow breath, and let's wander gently into the life of one of medieval Europe's most unlucky midwives. Her name was Walpurga Hausmännin. Yes, that is her real name. And yes, it sounds like someone sneezed while trying to name a farm animal. But she was, in reality, a perfectly normal woman living in the Bavarian countryside in the late 1500s. A midwife. A healer. A mother. A person who probably just wanted people to stop knocking on her door at midnight for medical help that she definitely was not paid enough for. Let's float slowly into her world. Walpurga lived in Dillingen, a peaceful little town that had, unfortunately for her, one major problem: everyone was a little too obsessed with the devil. Not in a fun Halloween way. More like, the devil definitely lives in my attic and also inside your goat, kind of way. The late 1500s were a golden age for blaming supernatural forces for literally everything. Baby has a rash. Must be witches. Cow stops producing milk. Also witches. Bread didn't rise properly. Witches. Your husband is lazy. I mean, probably still witches, but maybe also he's just lazy. Midwives were always standing right there in the middle of this chaos, close enough to the mysteries of birth to look powerful, but powerless enough to be blamed when things went wrong. And in medieval Europe, things went wrong a lot. Birthing rooms weren't exactly hygienic. You know, no sterilization, no antiseptics, no germ theory, and absolutely no respect for personal space. Just a midwife, a handful of herbs, a couple of sharp tools, and prayers whispered like background music. So when a mother died in childbirth, which was tragically common, people needed a reason. A face. A culprit. Preferably someone already a little bit inconvenient. And midwives were very convenient. Walpurga had practiced midwifery for years, and by all accounts, she was good at it. Too good, apparently. She had delivered dozens of children, healed fevers, and performed all the messy tasks that made other villagers gag. But competence could be suspicious. Anyone who seemed too skilled was obviously dealing with dark forces, because apparently, hard work and experience were not options medieval people considered. Let's float over to one little incident that started her undoing. A rumor. That's all it ever takes. Someone, probably a neighbor who didn't like how Walpurga looked at her cabbage patch, whispered that Walpurga sometimes muttered words under her breath while working. Which, yes, she probably did. You try delivering a breech baby at 2 a.m. in winter with nothing but a candle and a handful of herbs. You'd mutter things too. But to her neighbors, mumbling was suspicious. And suspicious became dangerous. Especially when the local authorities were already hungry for witchcraft confessions, the way modern historians are hungry for obscure footnotes. By the late 1500s, Bavaria had wholeheartedly embraced witch hunts. Judges wanted results. Clergy wanted examples. Villagers wanted explanations. The torture chambers were, regrettably, open for business. Walpurga was accused formally in 1587. The charges? Let's take a sleepy stroll through some of them. First charge. She allegedly bewitched infants. Which, translated from medieval nonsense, meant, infants sometimes died. Because they were infants in the 1500s. Second charge. She supposedly turned into a black cat. Not metaphorically. Literally. It's always a black cat. Medieval Europe really had one plotline and stuck to it. If someone sneezed too loud, someone else saw a black cat and suddenly the whole town was convinced Satan was running a pet adoption agency. Third charge. She was said to have eaten babies. Because when imagination and fear spiral together, the accusations get very creative and extremely unhelpful. None of these accusations had evidence. Of course they didn't. But evidence wasn't really fashionable back then. Walpurgis interrogators did what interrogators usually did during witch trials: they tortured her until she said something, anything, everything. Torture was considered a reliable form of truth extraction, which is possibly one of the worst historical ideas humanity collectively agreed on. She eventually confessed to the usual script. She made a pact with the devil. She took part in nocturnal gatherings. She harmed infants using magic. She worked spells with salves. Basically, she repeated whatever they wanted to hear. Not because it was true, but because her choices were. Confess, or continue being tortured in all the ways you never want to imagine before bedtime. The sad reality is that Walpurga didn't stand a chance. She was a midwife in a superstitious era, and midwives always carried the dual burden of being needed, and being feared. Let's float a bit deeper into why midwives were so vulnerable. Birth was the biggest unknown event in medieval life. People didn't understand anatomy. They didn't know about bacteria. The boundary between life and death felt thin, like a curtain always about to flutter open. Women died often. Babies died often. And when the stakes are that high, fear turns sharp and looks for a target. Midwives, with their herbs in hands and whispered prayers, lived right in that crossroads. They were both respected and mistrusted. A strange combination. Like being the village doctor and the village scapegoat at the same time. If they saved a life, God has blessed her hands. If something went wrong, she consorts with demons. Walpurgis' downfall wasn't personal. It was structural. She belonged to a profession that people relied on and resented, needed and feared. And in a time obsessed with witchcraft, that was a dangerous place to exist. Her trial was public, as these things often were. Spectators gathered, as if human tragedy was a form of entertainment. And honestly, if your choices were watching a witch trial or listening to medieval lute music for the 15th time that week, you probably picked the witch trial. Not because it was moral, but because medieval entertainment options were aggressively limited. She was executed in 1587. Slowly, painfully, and publicly. A warning. A spectacle. A message to other midwives who might dare to be too competent or too unlucky. And just like that, Walpurga became another name on the long, tragic list of women who were punished for being necessary: the quiet fall of Eva, the midwife who knew too much. Approximate 1500 to 2000 words. Alright, let's settle back in. Take a breath. We're gliding from late medieval Bavaria into the smoky, stone-walled streets of 17th-century Würzburg, a place where the witch trials were so enthusiastic they made other witch-hunting towns look, well, a little underachieving. Tonight, we drift into the Lee. She was a midwife. She had a husband. A few children. A house with a wooden door that creaked too loudly in winter. And a job that placed her directly in the line of fire during one of the most aggressive witch-hunting waves in all of Europe. Let's drift inside her world. Eva lived in Würzburg in the early 1600s. And if you're wondering what that was like, imagine a town where absolutely everyone was convinced the devil was hiding behind every mildly suspicious event. If a storm rolled in, devil. If someone tripped on a stone, devil pushed it. If a loaf of bread tasted weird, definitely devil, or possibly just bad wheat, but medieval people didn't like that explanation as much. The Würzburg witch trials were particularly intense. Between 1626 and 1631, hundreds of people, children, old men, priests, students, wine sellers, and of course, midwives, were accused, tortured, and executed. The authorities were determined to cleanse the city of evil, which unfortunately meant they kind of executed half the population in the process. Eva was a midwife of maybe 20 years' experience. Not young, but not old. The kind of midwife who learned by doing, because education for women was more of a theoretical concept than a real thing. She probably learned from her mother, or an aunt, or another older midwife whose hands shook from too many cold winters. Her job was intimate, messy, and brutally demanding. Birth didn't care whether it was raining, or if it was midnight, or if Eva's own child had a fever. When someone knocked on her door and shouted her name, she went. That was the job. And people needed her. But like many midwives of her time, Eva knew things she wasn't supposed to know, at least not according to the church. She knew which herbs could ease pain, which leaves helped with menstrual cramps, which roots could speed up labor, which seeds could prevent pregnancy. And there was the problem. Medieval authorities tolerated midwives, barely. But any hint, even the tiniest whisper, that a midwife might be helping women control their fertility, that was dangerous. Not because of morality. Not because of religion. But because childbirth meant more laborers, more soldiers, more tithes, more everything that authorities wanted. So midwives who knew too much, even if they never used the knowledge, were walking on thin ice. Eva's ice was particularly thin. Let's drift toward the moment things began to unravel. One winter, an infant died shortly after birth. It wasn't unusual. Infant mortality in medieval Europe was tragically common, sometimes nearly half of all babies didn't survive childhood. But this particular family had political connections, and political connections always make grief sharper, louder, and more determined to find someone to blame. Eva had delivered the child. She had done everything right. But the baby died anyway. People whispered. Then murmured. Then repeated stories with slight embellishments. She looked nervous, someone said. She muttered something, someone else added. I heard she uses strange herbs, whispered another. Of course she used herbs. That's what midwives did. It wasn't sorcery, it was the closest thing they had to medicine. But nuance and grief rarely get along. A month later, another rumor surfaced. A woman claimed Eva had given her an herbal mixture, for pain. She didn't specify what pain, or whether the herbs even worked. But by the time her story traveled through 3 households and a tavern, it had transformed into something more sinister. She gave her herbs to kill a child. She knows how to stop pregnancy. She works with hidden knowledge. She has the devil's medicine. By spring, Eva went from respected midwife to quiet suspect. Her neighbors watched her a little too carefully. Her patients began to choose younger midwives. Her name was mentioned in church sermons, not directly, but with hints sharp enough for everyone to understand. And then came the accusation. One cold evening, 2 officials knocked on her door. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a soft, deliberate knock, which, honestly, might be even worse. Because quiet knocks mean decisions have already been made. Eva was taken into custody. Her children cried. Her husband begged. But the officials had their orders. Let's float into the interrogation room, slowly, gently, because these places were not known for kindness. Würzburg's witch hunts were among the most systemized in Europe. They had precise procedures for questioning. And by questioning, of course, they meant torture. To extract truth, they believed, one must extract pain. Eva denied everything at first. Calmly. Steadily. She was a practical woman. Midwives had to be. She had seen death, birth, blood, screams, she was not easily shaken. But no one can remain steady forever under medieval interrogation. They asked the usual questions. Did she meet the devil? Did she use spells during childbirth? Did she harm infants? Did she fly at night? Did she use potions? Did she work with other witches? Eva answered no to every one. She didn't even understand most of the accusations. She was a midwife, not a mythological creature. But prolonged torture has a predictable outcome. After enough pain, enough fear, enough exhaustion, she began giving the answers they wanted. Not because they were true, but because humans break. Even strong ones. She confessed to impossible things, attending night gatherings, speaking with spirits, using ointments that didn't exist. Her confession wasn't a story. It was a survival tactic. Unfortunately, in Würzburg, confessing did not mean surviving. It just meant the trial could proceed. Eva was executed not long after. Quietly. Efficiently. And as anonymously as historians still fear, because hundreds of names were burned, buried, or forgotten. Her house was searched. Her herbs were confiscated. Her belongings were auctioned. Her family, like many families of accused witches, was left in a kind of social exile. Her children grew up avoiding eye contact. Avoiding questions. Avoiding the shadow of their mother's name. And Eva became another silent mark in the long, cruel pattern, midwives punished for knowledge they weren't supposed to have, the last days of Marion le Touse, a midwife caught between two worlds. All right. Let's settle in again. Take a slow breath. Loosen your shoulders. And drift with me across the channel, into a quieter but equally complicated corner of medieval life, Normandy in the 14th century. Tonight we wander into the life of Marion le Touse, one of the better documented midwives of medieval France. Not because she was famous. Not because she did anything grand. But because she got tangled in a legal case that left behind a surprisingly detailed paper trail. The kind historians love. The kind villagers at the time probably wished didn't exist. Marion lived in a world that sat halfway between two medieval realities. On one side, communities that needed midwives desperately. And on the other, church authorities who distrusted anyone who worked with bodies, blood, or knowledge they themselves didn't fully understand. She was caught right in that crack, the seam between necessity and suspicion. Let's drift toward her slowly. Marion lived in a small Norman town, the sort that had one main street, one tavern, and a handful of people whose entire personality was complaining about the weather. Her house was modest, with herbs drying from beams, bottles of oils, and cloth bundles containing items that were definitely not magical, but certainly looked suspicious if you didn't know what they were. She wasn't old. She wasn't young. She was in that ageless middle of life where medieval people either settled into useful professions or quietly disappeared from records entirely. Marion chose usefulness. She became a sage femme, literally a wise woman, the French term for midwife. Her training, as usual, came from another midwife, who probably learned from someone else's grandmother, and so on. Medieval medicine wasn't written down in textbooks. It lived in hands, memories, and whispered instructions at births lit by dim candles. Marion was known for being calm. Even when everything else around her wasn't. She had a way of speaking softly, even when a perfect setup for conflict. Let's drift toward the day Marion got pulled into trouble, slowly, like watching a torch flicker in a drafty stone corridor. It began with a birth that went wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not scandalously wrong. Just wrong enough to cause whispers. A mother named Isabel had a long, difficult labor. Marion attended throughout, 12 hours, then 20, then 30. Birth could stretch on endlessly in a world without proper tools or pain relief. At some point during the ordeal, Marion whispered prayers. Not unusual. Midwives prayed constantly. Sometimes because of faith, sometimes because it helped calm the mother, and sometimes because whispering anything is better than listening to 30 hours of screaming. But one relative, a cousin who had been pacing in the next room and who, frankly, was not handling the situation well, claimed she heard Marion whispering not prayers, but incantations. Or at least words she didn't recognize. Which, to be fair, might have been normal medical instructions said quietly under stress. But medieval ears were primed to interpret anything unusual as dangerous. The birth ended badly. The child was stillborn. Isabel survived, weak and exhausted. And grief, as we've seen before, often reshapes memory. That cousin, stressed, emotional, and probably hungry, repeated what she thought she heard. Marion spoke strange words. Not like prayers. She muttered over the body. She touched the child in an odd way. Rumors don't need facts. They just need emotion. And this rumor had plenty. Within a week, Marion was summoned. Not arrested, not yet. Medieval France handled these things a little differently than German territories. The Church preferred inquiries first, accusations later. But an inquiry alone was enough to alter the course of a life. Marion stood before a small tribunal, a priest, a clerk, and a local official whose main talent seemed to be taking notes extremely slowly. They questioned her gently at first. Then less gently. Did she use charms? Did she use herbs without approval? Did she say words not found in church prayers? Did she make gestures not sanctioned by the clergy? Did she, God forbid, attempt baptisms without permission? The last one mattered most. Midwives in medieval France were technically allowed to perform emergency baptisms. But only within very strict guidelines, and only when the infant's life was clearly in danger. Baptism was a matter of the soul, and the Church guarded souls like they were expensive property. Marion insisted she did nothing wrong. She used herbs, yes. But normal ones. She whispered, yes. But prayers, not spells. She touched the infant's head, yes. But she always did that, it was part of her work. Still, there was something in the air. A feeling. A suspicion growing like mold behind a wall. The tribunal wasn't convinced. Let's drift into her second questioning, where things took a darker turn. By now, some of Marion's neighbors had started remembering, or maybe imagining, little things she'd done over the years. She once told me which herbs helped with cramps, one woman said. She told me not to drink cold water during pregnancy, said another. She said my baby would be born early, and he was, said a third. Suddenly, her ordinary skills seemed uncanny. Her knowledge looked suspicious. Her calmness appeared unnatural. The tribunal leaned in. The priest narrowed his eyes. The clerk probably smudged his ink for dramatic effect. Where did you learn these things? Who taught you these methods? Why do you know what you know? Why you, and not the Church? Marion didn't understand the shape of the trap closing around her. Knowledge was her trade. Understanding the body was her work. Experience was her teacher. But medieval authorities weren't looking for explanations. They were looking for threats. Marion wasn't tortured. France used less torture in these cases than Germany. But pressure, psychological, moral, and social, was its own kind of pain. She was isolated. Questioned repeatedly. Warned of consequences. Threatened with spiritual punishment. And like many midwives before her, she broke in the smallest, saddest way. She didn't confess to witchcraft. No. She confessed to imperfection. I may have said the words wrong. I may have used herbs I should not have used. I may have touched the infant incorrectly. I may have prayed in fear, not properly. It wasn't a confession of guilt. It was a confession of being human. But to the tribunal, that was enough. She had admitted error. And error could be twisted into negligence. And negligence, in the medieval mind, was the thin edge of malice. Marion was punished, but not executed. Her penalty was quieter, and somehow more devastating. She lost her license to practice. She was forbidden to assist at births. She was fined more money than she could ever earn. She was ordered to perform penance, public, humiliating penance. And in a world where a woman's profession defined her survival, Marion effectively disappeared. No more steady work. No more calling. No more place in the village. Her reputation evaporated. Her patients turned elsewhere. Her tools gathered dust. Her hands, once steady and skilled, no longer brought life into the world. Marion lived perhaps another 10 or 15 years, long enough to watch younger, less experienced midwives take her place. Long enough to hear people whisper her name the way one whispers a ghost story. Long enough to know that her knowledge, once valued, now frightened people. She faded quietly. And history let her go just as quietly. Her story survives only in trial notes, scribbles from a clerk who probably didn't care. But those scribbles reveal a pattern, the slow, bureaucratic way midwives were unmade. Not by fire. Not by spectacle. But by suspicion and slow erasure. Good night.